Welcome to another movie plot and enjoy the memories. We open in the Los Angeles Coliseum at a training session of the NFL team the Rams. Quarterback Joe is recovering from a knee injury, but the coaches repeatedly comment on his good form. The only one of his trainers worth a shout out is Max, because he's the only one who visits Joe to celebrate his birthday. He's a good friend of Joe's who relaxes with his saxophone while drinking bean curd and spinach mold because apparently that's healthy. Max brings in a birthday cake to ruin his diet and says that the coach wants Joe to open for the first game of the season. The 58-year-old man must listen to this athlete complain about being sore from working his whole life, while needing to have his own spine choked into position every so often just to have enough strength to poorly slice a cake. The quarterback steps up his training for the big game by running more and cycling, but one day he rides through a tunnel and splat. Joe is killed by a van, sending him to a way station in heaven where a celestial assistant called the Escort gives him the tour. Because he has his sax and is about to board a plane, Joe believes he's dreaming, but the station takes a familiar appearance from your imagination. When the supervising angel Mr. Jordan checks on the delays, it's hard to find Joe among the clouds as he thinks push-ups will help him wake up. Jordan explains that Joe is dead, so he says there must be some kind of mistake, but the Escort argues that he doesn't make mistakes. Verifying Joe's life expectancy, it turns out he isn't due to arrive until the year 2025, which is another 50 years away. The Escort admits that he pulled Joe's soul out of his body before the collision to save him from suffering, but it turned out to be a bit premature. Jordan orders the Escort to return Joe to his body, but time must move slowly in heaven because his body's already been cremated. As an apology, the angel decides to take over his case personally and help Joe find another body that he can occupy. It needs to be a fresh corpse that hasn't been discovered, so the first candidate's a graceful trapeze artist, but he's too small for football. The second is a race car driver, but Joe doesn't want to speak German, so after a few more, Jordan says that the choices are becoming limited. When they enter the home of a millionaire industrialist, Joe thinks he could get used to this, so they check out the owner. We never actually see Leo Farnsworth, who's recently been poisoned by his wife and left to drown in the bath upstairs.
Slowly sliding into the water.
Since nobody can hear Joe begging for help, he observes the scheming wife Julia, who's having an affair with her husband's secretary Tony. It isn't like Farnsworth was a good man anyway, as his new refinery will force the eviction of families from their homes. A displaced schoolteacher named Betty arrives at the mansion to dispute the construction with Farnsworth, but Tony says he's still asleep. Joe is smitten with Betty and wants to help her, but doesn't want to be this rich douchebag because he isn't some kind of super athlete. Betty does the whole sulky lip quiver thing, so Joe's like, "Alright coach, put me in to save this girl's town, then we'll find someone better." When the butler Sisk is sent by Tony to get Farnsworth, assuming that he'll discover the corpse, Joe has already inhabited the soggy vessel. He still appears like himself, but everyone else sees him as their employer, which is why they get so uncomfortably close. Joe gets dressed in some safari-looking polo attire simply to meet with Betty, who objects to the plans of building the refinery. Before any swooning, Julia enters and screams hysterically, so Tony drags her away and insists that she only saw a mouse. Betty's confused by Joe claiming that his own wife is none of his business and his immediate agreement to build the refinery somewhere else. But then he says that he isn't really Farnsworth, so Betty thinks he's taunting the small-town school teacher and angrily storms out. Julia and Tony think that Joe's plotting revenge and become very skittish from here on out that he's going to get them. Joe's too preoccupied with business to take any notice of them, and on his way to a board meeting he's swarmed by reporters. Upon seeing Betty with the group, he invites them inside, where one man asks if the company's new power plant will destroy their home should an earthquake hit. Tony says define destroy, while Joe gives a speech about the company with football terminology that none of these suits understand. He says that they should relocate things like the power plant and refinery because of lawsuits, but it's really just to help Betty. There's a cannon at Joe's new place that goes off every time the flag's raised or lowered and has Julia jumping out of her skin. Joe keeps up with the news about his team and needs to talk with Jordan in a closet so that the nosy maids don't think he's crazy. The Angels are still searching for an athletic body for him to play football in, but Sisk alerts Joe that Betty has come to visit. She's here to thank Farnsworth for relocating the refinery and goes with Joe to have dinner at some fancy restaurant. While scoffing down burgers in the backseat of his limo, Joe tells Betty that he thinks she's attractive, but I'm guessing Farnsworth isn't. That's not to say that Betty doesn't find him attractive, but admits that it's because of something special in his eyes and not his ugly face. As Joe drops her off at home, he tells Betty that he's separated from his wife and only lives with her because it's such a big house. With more dates coming up, he tells the Escort he wants to remain in this body and get into shape instead of finding someone else. He then tells Julia that he wants a divorce and for Tony to call Max because he knows he's hiding behind the wife's curtains. This pair have rigged up the heavy fixture above Joe's bed to crush him to death, but by dumb luck he avoids it and is none the wiser. He just tells Tony to order him a replacement, and the following day Max arrives at the home of the stranger who summoned him. Joe says that he wants to try out for the Rams quarterback, but Max would be ruining his reputation on some millionaire's whim. He recommends some other minor league teams, but Joe reveals his real identity and the Angels' switching of bodies. Max initially thinks that this guy needs a therapist, but Farnsworth gives him the old neck crank and plays the saxophone as horribly as Joe. Realizing it's his old friend and thinking there's an angel in the corner, Joe returns to find Max talking to the wall because Jordan already left. The estate grounds become a training camp for Joe and all of his butlers until he decides to just buy the LA Rams. It cost him $67 million, but now nobody can prevent him from training with professionals or playing as the quarterback. The team think that the new owner will just give up after one practice game, especially when they vow not to go easy on him. They don't even wait for the hike, and Joe receives no help from his offensive line. They just let him get sacked multiple times. When he finally gets a chance to complete a pass, the team is impressed, so they continue to let him display his abilities. The coaches think that they might have something to work with, while Joe claims to have developed his throwing arm from polo. Sometime later, Joe invites Betty around to the estate during a gathering of stuffy executives from his company. Julia watches from her bedroom window, nervous that it has something to do with Farnsworth's plan to kill them. She's prevented from getting hysterical by Tony, who this time prepares to murder her husband by just shooting him. Joe takes Betty for a stroll around the estate and talk about fearlessness when he asks the woman he's only met twice to marry him. She seems excited, but before she can answer, Joe learns the devastating news from the escort that he must vacate his current body. They've found him a replacement, but Joe's heartbroken, so he walks Betty out to her car and tries to memorize her face. He asks her to remember what she saw in his eyes and tells her not to be afraid before hugging Betty and saying wait for his call. Jordan shows up to collect him, but Joe refuses to leave, insisting that he's going to play in the Super Bowl and marry Betty. The angel says we can't change what's written when Tony times his shot with the cannon, sending Joe's body tumbling into the well. No longer inside Farnsworth, he climbs out of the well with his saxophone in hand and follows Jordan back up to heaven. Everyone begins searching for Farnsworth, but with his disappearance and not calling Betty, she goes down to the police station. She reports him missing, while Max lets it be known that Farnsworth told him that Julia and Tony killed him the first time. Everyone just thinks he's delusional, while they're all rounded up by a detective for questioning and watch the game at the estate. The Super Bowl between the LA Rams and the Pittsburgh Steelers gets underway while everyone argues about who the killers are. Julia pretends like her husband was still in love with her, but Betty knows that's not true because he never spoke a word about her. Joe listens in on their conversations when the gardener discovers Farnsworth's jacket in the well and comes running into the room holding it. Julia immediately puts the blame on Tony, who in turn points the finger back at her when suddenly the Rams quarterback breaks his neck. Jordan teleports Joe to the game and allows him to occupy his dead teammate's body and run back onto the field to play. Max recognizes over the television that it's Joe, so he races down to the stadium as the Rams go on to win the Super Bowl. During the locker room celebrations, Max arrives for a nice big hug, but while giving an interview, Mr. Jordan appears. He says that this will be Joe's permanent body, then returns to heaven while Joe's memory is wiped of all his previous lives. They're all replaced with the other quarterbacks, which is unfortunate because now he doesn't remember his friendship with Max. He thinks the coach is just drunk when he keeps calling him Joe and offering him the saxophone, until Max eventually realizes that the Joe he knew is gone. Now some dude named Tom. He goes to leave but runs into Betty searching for Max and introduces himself to the stranger. The lights suddenly go out, so Tom escorts Betty outside and says there's nothing to be afraid of, which she recognizes as a Joe quote. Betty looks deep into his eyes, then upon learning that he's the quarterback, accepts his invitation to go have coffee. And the movie ends.